Okay, welcome. Today I wanted to offer some reflections about Harry Potter and the connection to boarding school syndrome, and also adverse childhood experiences and attachment theory. So, enjoy. So, I've been a fan of Harry Potter since probably 2002. I started to read the first book and really kind of got very much into them. And as I went through a healing journey where I started to explore my own boarding school experience, I was reading these books at the same time, and I had so many tears. I remember reading The Goblet of Fire, and when Cedric Diggory dies halfway through, a third of the way from the end, I just was crying because it reminded me of boarding school, because I lost a friend in a not a similar way, but I lost a friend that age. So what I wanted to do today was just to kind of draw upon a few of the stories from Harry Potter and how that link into boarding school syndrome, adverse childhood experiences, ACES, and attachment theory. I'll be drawing upon different ideas from Joy Chavarin and her book Boarding School Syndrome. I'll also be talking a little bit about The Power of Attachment by Diane Paul Heller, and some other books. So to begin with, I think it's really interesting is that those who are often very, who will talk about or have written about boarding school in their books are often non-boarders. So Enid Blyton often wrote about boarding school, and same with J.K. Rowling. She's written about Harry Potter and boarding school, and yet they weren't boarders themselves. Often those who were boarders don't write about boarding school, but you can often see in their work. So Aldous Huxley was at Eton, George Orwell. Eton, I believe that George Orwell's teacher was Aldous Huxley, and then you've got Ian Fleming, who did James Bond. These are people who were all at Eton, and their stories, certainly George Orwell's 1984, it's like, ooh, and as I was reading a couple of weeks ago, someone saying, well, 1984, that's boarding school. That's what he was kind of sharing. That's what someone was saying. So I think what often happens is we read something like Harry Potter and we go, oh, it sounds like a really exciting place. And the intake for boarding schools really rose around the time of Harry Potter. It was seen as something people wanted to go to. So I just want to speak a little bit about some of the stories in there and how that links into trauma and boarding school syndrome. So the first thing really is the psychological look of attachment. So attachment theory started by John Bowlby in the 30s, who was a psychiatrist, and he'd also been to boarding school. He went at age 4, and on a postcard to his wife many years later, he said, I wouldn't send my dog to boarding school. His experiences were really not good. He based a lot of his teaching, this idea of attachment theory, on 3 principles of there being different types of attachment. So you had secure attachment, and I'll read you the definition of a secure attachment because that will help you understand a little bit more. So secure attachment, this is the type of attachment in the ideal situation. Securely attached people typically grew up with plenty of love and support from consistently responsive caregivers, and as adults they are interdependent, connecting with others in healthy, mutually beneficial ways. They are okay both in connection and on their own. So first of all, for me, Harry Potter is not securely attached, for the reason that he didn't have a very easy upbringing, with his parents dying when he was born, and then growing up with the Dursley. I'll come back to that in a bit. Then we've got the avoidant attachment, which is people with this attachment style have a tendency to keep intimacy at arm's length and to diminish the importance of relationships. They often were neglected, left alone too much as children, rejected by their caregivers, or their parents weren't present enough, or present when teaching them some type of task. Avoidants have disconnected, put the brakes on their attachment system, so reconnecting to others in a safe and healthy ways is extremely important. So the psychiatrist, the psychotherapist, Anne Power, she wrote this paper in Attachment in, I think it was 2008. She talks about boarding school syndrome and attachment theory. And what she says is most ex-boarders become avoidant. So what that means is we grow up and we don't have that care from parents. We're kind of neglected, and essentially boarding school is a form of neglect. And as Batman Galedge, she says sexual abuse is actually has a beginning and an end, whereas neglect, it has no beginning and end, and therefore in some ways can be seen as worse. And I don't know the exact quote, but something along those lines, that neglect, which something like boarding school is actually, it's an important thing to look at. The other types of attachment are ambivalent. People with the ambivalence adaptation deal with a lot of anxiety about having their needs met or feeling secure in being loved or lovable. And then you've got the disorganized attachment. This attachment style is characterized by an excess of fear, and the attachment system is at cross purposes with the instinct to survive threat. When stressed, sick, or frightened, a child naturally wants to seek comfort and protection from a loving parent. But what do they do when the same parent is the source of fear or distress? People with this style can get stuck in a threat response and or swing between avoidance and ambivalence without much of an identifiable pattern. So that just gives you an idea. So for me, Harry Potter really is more avoidant. He's grown up essentially on his own. He's had to deal with himself. But I would also say someone like Ron Weasley, he's also avoidant. And for the reason that his parents also boarded. He would have seen his brothers, Fred, I can't remember the other one, were sent off, and even his older brother, Percy. So he would have seen, that's what happens. So it's like being prepared for that. And also, some of the examples of this is if you think during the school year, often Ron or Harry will stay at school. Later on they then start spending Christmases with their parents. But just noticing, sometimes it might be a whole year. It's only summer holidays when they actually see their parents. Could you imagine that? I think when I was at boarding school, I went 6 months more or less without seeing my parents. And I've often heard this from clients. It's kind of very common. So in the Goblet of Fire, Ron's parents come and visit Harry Potter to go and see how he's getting on. And Ron in the book is surprised. It's like, I didn't know they were coming. So if you think about this, I can't remember if he went back at Christmas, but he hasn't seen them for months, and they suddenly turn up. And, so what essentially this is saying is like, okay, Ron has learned to just cope on his own. Then Hermione, I would suggest, is possibly a secure attachment. She had really, loving parents, but often, as Anne Power talks in her paper, that's actually harder when you get to boarding school. And I've often heard people who have secure attachment, but then they're crying on the phone to their parents every night. They really get homesick. Okay, so then Harry, when he gets to Hogwarts, he has his attachment figures. Dumbledore. He has Hagrid. So they make that connection with Hagrid. Again, though, they don't see them very often. I think this is important to link this in boarding school syndrome, is that the adults aren't really around very much. Who are they learning from? They're learning from the children. If you look at McGonagall, she is the house mistress of Gryffindor, but you never see her there. In the books, you never hear her actually coming into the space. So who is looking after? Who is making sure that people do what they say? And it would have been the older students, the prefects. So I think this is important to see that who did they learn from? It was from the other children. So as they got older, again, who did they learn from? From the other children. They didn't have the chance to speak to adults. And I think this is important, because what we then get is we've modeled ourselves to be adults from other children, not from adults. And that's a really key thing that Harry Potter, for me, shows me. There's also, for me, the thing of Dumbledore in one of the books, I think it's possibly 5 or 6, when Dumbledore won't even speak to Harry because he's worried that of Voldemort. And there are times in the books where, so this is an attachment figure. Harry has no one to speak to. He might go and see Hagrid, but he might not be around. So there is a time, certainly in the Goblet of Fire, when no one will talk to Harry Potter. And you can just imagine what trauma that must be. In a school, everyone goes, Potter stinks. And he's got no one really to speak to. I think at that point, possibly Dumbledore's not around that much. So I'm just seeing that, and I think when I was reading this, I'm like, oh, that must be really painful, because I can remember what that's like. Richard Beard, in his book Sad Little Men, talks about that the custos is the person in boarding school. On each year, there's always one custos, the person that everyone has a go at. And there's that period that's Harry Potter. The first year when he's doing Quidditch, it's fine, he's the hero. But as certain points, he's also kind of the custos. People see him as bad. So for me, that's a trauma, being sent to Coventry. There's also the times when Harry and Ron fall out. They won't speak to each other. They're living in that space, and just how difficult that is for a few months. Another thing that Harry Potter shows up, which is common in boarding school, is no privacy. They can pull a curtain around them, but they don't have their own rooms. And as Joy Shaverin speaks about, believe it, in her book Boarding School Syndrome, this idea that as a boy or a girl coming into puberty, you really need privacy, as you start to explore your sexuality. I think maybe just kind of starting to tie this together, this idea of the ABCD of boarding school syndrome. So really, for a child, we're abandoned, which Joy Shaverin talks about. We're left in this place and our parents suddenly disappear. In Harry Potter's situation, it's slightly different, but he's still basically alone. Then B is bereavement, this homesickness. It's like suddenly you don't have the parents there. And C is captivity. You can't escape. If you think of Harry Potter, they can't escape the grounds. They get told off if they wander a bit further afield. So, as I've shared in one of my other videos, that Stephen Fry says prison was easy for him because he'd been in boarding school. So the D of the ABCD of boarding school syndrome is dissociation. Because of those first three, we then dissociate, we shut our feelings down. And you can often see this in Harry Potter, that he struggles to connect to his emotions. He has so many terrible things go on. Sirius Black dies. All of these things. how does he deal with that? And we don't necessarily see him being really able to cry that much. I think there's a few instances, but it's that stiff upper lip. So yeah, and I'll end it with a couple of quotes that Louis de Bernier, who wrote the book Captain Corelli's Mandolin, among other books, who was at boarding school, he says boarding schools are really orphanages for children who have parents. And then Joy Shaverin, she talks about boarding school system is a particularly British form of child abuse. Yeah. So I think this is important. What's something like Harry Potter? I love the stories, but they kind of normalize boarding school as maybe a good thing. And for me, in my experience, is that yes, there's good things from boarding school, but there's also the shadow side of it. And I think if you're interested in this subject, recommend Boarding School Syndrome, Joy Shaverin, The Making of Them by Nick Duffel, Sad Little Men by Richard Beard, and yeah, Attachment Theory as well by Diane Poole Heller, The Power of Attachment. So yeah, if you have any questions, just some psychological reflections about Harry Potter, and maybe this is right, but just I was fascinated by this. I didn't have time to look into ACES, but essentially the adverse childhood experiences is saying that if you have 4 or more ACES, and I would say that Harry Potter, in going through the question, he has 4. So did his parents humiliate him? Yes, the Dursley did. The second one about food, not having enough food, again, the Dursley, and then no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, again, that's another one. And yeah, you didn't have enough food to eat. So I think, and also the death of his parents. So what they say, if you have 4 or more ACEs, you are 10 to 12 times greater risk of intravenous drug use and attempted suicide, 2 to 3 times greater risk for developing heart disease and cancer, and 32 times more likely to have behavioral and learning problems. And 8 out of 10 leading causes of death in the US are connected with exposure to 4 or more ACEs. So I just think, here are these stories. And this is some of the research, the adverse childhood experiences is a fascinating area of research. So it is quite a long video today. I hope you've enjoyed. If you've got any other questions, please do let me know.